The Deep Space Survey vessel, Aurora's Light, glided silently above the uncharted world of Epsilon 9, its sleek hull reflecting the crimson light of twin suns hanging low in the alien sky. On the observation deck, Dr. Lena Morales pressed her palm against the transparent aluminum viewport, dark eyes scanning the stark landscape below with a mixture of scientific curiosity and quiet wonder. "Magnificent desolation," she murmured, cataloging the sweeping arid deserts, spindly rock formations that reached toward the blood-red sky like skeletal fingers, and patches of strange, phosphorescent flora that dotted the landscape like fallen stars. The preliminary scans barely did it justice. Behind her, a tall figure moved with fluid grace that belied his 7-foot stature. Thrix of Corrales approached the viewport, his silver-blue skin adorned with intricate, bioluminescent markings that pulsed gently in the dim light of the observation deck. His 4-fingered hand joined hers at the glass, though not touching. "Your words echo the Corrales greeting for new worlds," he said, his voice a melodic resonance that seemed to vibrate in Lena's chest rather than her ears. "We say, beauty sleeps in harshness, waiting to be awakened by understanding eyes." Lena turned to face her mission partner. After 3 weeks aboard the Aurora's Light, she was still adjusting to the alien's presence, the way his large, pupilless eyes reflected light, like polished opals. How his expressions formed through subtle shifts in his bioluminescent patterns, rather than facial muscles. "That's quite poetic for a scout," she said with a small smile. Thrix's markings rippled in what she had come to recognize as amusement. "And you are quite rigid for an explorer of worlds, Dr. Morales." "Lena," she corrected him automatically. "And I'm rigorous, not rigid. There's a difference." "As you say," his head tilted in acknowledgement. "Our shuttle departs in 30 minutes. Commander Ellis expects your final equipment check complete by then." Lena nodded, turning back to the viewport for one last look at the planet that would be their home for the next 2 weeks. The Joint Human-Corrales Exploration Initiative had paired them specifically for this mission, her expertise in exobiology, complementing his natural telepathic abilities to sense life forms. Their objective cataloged the unique ecosystem of Epsilon 9 and evaluate its potential for future research outposts. An hour later, the exploration shuttle broke atmosphere, descending through wispy crimson clouds toward a mesa that preliminary scans had identified as an ideal base camp. Lena secured her equipment in the cargo webbing as the craft buffeted through air currents. "I still don't understand why we couldn't use the portable molecular analyzer," she said, bracing herself against the shuttle wall. "Your ritual-based approach to ecosystem analysis seems unnecessarily time-consuming." Thrix, seated in perfect stillness, despite the turbulence, regarded her with what she interpreted as patience. "The Corrales method does not simply catalog species, Dr. Morales. It establishes relationship. Life responds to life. Your machine would give you facts but miss the connections." "Connections are just data points waiting for pattern recognition," Lena countered, but without heat. This had become their comfortable debate over the weeks of preparation. Perhaps that is why Corrales discovered sentient plant networks on Proxima b, while humans classified them as primitive flora for a decade. Thrix said, his markings betraying a hint of smugness. Before Lena could reply, the shuttle rocked violently. Warning lights flooded the cabin with pulsing red. "What's happening?" Lena called to the pilot, a young lieutenant whose fingers flew across the control interfaces. "Electromagnetic anomaly," the pilot shouted back. "It wasn't on any of the scans. Systems failing, losing power." Thrix moved with surprising speed to the co-pilot seat. "Energy signature is similar to the veil storms of the Arcturus system. They come without warning and—" The rest of his words were lost as the shuttle lurched, throwing Lena against the bulkhead. Pain exploded behind her eyes. Through blurring vision, she saw Thrix reaching for her, his bioluminescent patterns flaring bright with alarm. The last thing she registered Was his telepathic presence brushing against her consciousness, a sensation like cool water, flowing over heated skin before darkness claimed her? Consciousness returned to Lena in fragments, the acrid smell of burning circuitry, a dull, throbbing pain at her temple, the taste of blood and dust. She blinked, gritty eyes open to a nightmare landscape of twisted metal and sparking wires. The shuttle lay broken, its hull breached in multiple places, allowing Epsilon 9's harsh atmosphere to invade the cabin. "Lieutenant," she called, pulling herself upright with a wince. No response came from the pilot's seat, now crushed beneath a collapsed section of bulkhead. Fear spiked through her pain. "Thrix!" For several agonizing seconds, only the crackle of electrical fires answered her. Then a weak pulse of blue light drew her attention to a crumpled form, half buried under cargo containers near the rear hatch. Lena scrambled over debris, ignoring her own injuries. The alien lay motionless, his silver-blue skin dulled to ashen gray. Only the faint, irregular pulsing of his chest markings indicated life. "Hold on," she whispered, fingers seeking the carotid analog in his neck. The pulse she found was thread, but present. Working methodically through her own rising panic, Lena assessed the situation. The pilot was dead, the shuttle beyond salvage. The emergency beacon was damaged, its power core leaking radiation. Most of their supplies were either crushed or scattered across the crash site. A quick check of the communications array confirmed her worst fears. The electromagnetic storm had fried the circuits beyond field repair. But worst of all was the status of the vessel's power core. Its containment field was failing with barely controlled reactions, causing temperature spikes throughout the wreckage. They had hours, maybe less, before a catastrophic meltdown. Lena turned her attention back to Thrix, whose breathing had grown more labored. His species' physiology was resilient, but even Corrales had limits. Using the emergency medkit she'd recovered, she administered a universal stabilizing agent, knowing it was designed primarily for human biology. "I can't lose you too," she murmured, memories of another crash, another partner lost under her watch, threatening to overwhelm her. 5 years ago on Europa, she'd failed to save Dr. Kaito when their ice crawler had plunged into a crevasse. The guilt still haunted her dreams. To her relief, Thrix's markings pulsed more strongly as the medication took effect. His opalescent eyes flickered open, focusing on her face with effort. "The pilot?" he asked, his telepathic empathy immediately sensing her distress. Lena shook her head once curtly. "We need to move. The core is destabilizing." With careful efficiency, she helped Thrix to his feet. Though towering over her, he leaned heavily on her shoulder, one arm clutched protectively around his torso. Together, they salvaged what supplies they could: a portable shelter module, water purification tools, emergency rations, a handheld scanner, and basic medical supplies. As they stepped through the breached hull into Epsilon 9's alien landscape, Lena felt the full impact of their isolation. The nearest outpost was an abandoned survey station, nearly 50 kilometers across the desert basin. Their only hope was to reach it and activate its emergency beacon, assuming it was still functional after years of neglect. The crimson sky had darkened to deep burgundy as the twin suns began their descent. Wind whipped across the barren landscape, carrying fine particles of sand that stung exposed skin. Thrix, recovering some strength, straightened to scan the horizon. "The canyon walls will offer some protection for the night," he said, pointing toward a distant ridge of black rock. "We should reach it before dark." Lena nodded, adjusting the weight of the supply pack. "We have 5 days of emergency rations if we stretch them. The water purifier will work on any moisture source we find." She hesitated, then added, "The rescue window closes in 8 days when the Aurora's light is scheduled to break orbit." Thrix's markings dimmed slightly, the Corellis equivalent of a grim nod. "Then we have no time to waste." As they began their trek across the harsh terrain, a distant explosion rocked the ground beneath their feet. Turning, they watched as the shuttle erupted in a plume of blue-white energy fragments of metal raining down across the crash site. There goes our ride, Lena said dryly, masking her growing fear with gallows humor. Thrix's markings pulsed in a pattern she couldn't interpret. Among my people, we say the universe never closes one path without opening another. Let's hope your people are right, Lena replied, turning her back on the smoldering wreckage and facing the vast alien desert that stood between them and survival. The first night on Epsilon 9 tested every survival skill Lena possessed. They reached the canyon as the last light faded from the crimson sky, revealing a star field. Unlike any visible from Earth, dense clusters of blue-white giants and swirling nebulae painted across the black canvas of space. Thrix found a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall, protected from the intensifying wind that howled through the rock formations, like a living thing. While Lena deployed the shelter module, a self-erecting structure designed to maintain livable conditions in hostile environments, Thrix gathered phosphorescent plants that grew in crevices along the rock face. These contain moisture, he explained, arranging them in a circle around their shelter. And their light will deter smaller predators. Predators, Lena paused in her work. The preliminary surveys didn't detect large fauna. Your scanners have limitations, Thrix replied simply. His wounds had been properly treated with the medical supplies, but he still moved with careful deliberation. I sense several species that hunt by night in these canyons. Small, but numerous. Lena frowned. Is that your empathic ability or an educated guess? Both. His markings pulsed with what might have been amusement. Corrales do not separate intuition from observation as rigidly as humans do. Inside the shelter, they inventoried their supplies more thoroughly. The water purifier was functioning at 80% capacity. Their rations would last 5 days if strictly rationed. The medical kit contained basic treatments for trauma infection and pain designed primarily for humans, but with some universal applicability. The scanner shows the abandoned outpost here, Lena said, projecting a holographic map onto the shelter wall. A blinking dot indicated their position. Another, nearly 50 kilometers distant, marked their destination. It was established during the initial survey of this system, then abandoned when more promising worlds were discovered in the next sector. The terrain between looks challenging, Thrix observed, studying the topographical rendering. Deep canyons, shifting dunes, minimal shelter. And the temperature range is extreme, Lena added. 50 degrees Celsius during peak day, dropping to near freezing at night. Thrix was silent for a moment, his markings flowing in contemplative patterns. We should travel primarily at dawn and dusk, he finally said. Rest during the heat of day and the cold of night. Lena nodded in agreement, then winced as pain lanced through her temple. The adrenaline that had carried her through the immediate aftermath of the crash was fading, leaving her acutely aware of her injuries and exhaustion. Thrix's gaze fixed on her with unsettling intensity. You require rest, Dr. Morales. Your body's energy patterns show significant distress. I'm fine, she said automatically, even as she swayed slightly where she sat. Humans. Thrix sighed, the sound oddly melodic. So determined to deny your physical limitations. With surprising gentleness, he guided her to lie down on one of the emergency thermal pads. Sleep. I will monitor our perimeter. Too tired to argue, Lena surrendered to exhaustion. Just before consciousness slipped away, she felt a strange, soothing sensation, like cool fingers, brushing across her mind, easing the sharp edges of pain and fear. Thrix's telepathic empathy, she realized distantly, offering what comfort he could. Thank you, she murmured, uncertain if she spoke the words aloud or merely thought them. Either way, she felt rather than heard his response, a gentle acknowledgement that followed her into dreamless sleep. Dawn broke across Epsilon 9 in sheets of amber and gold that gradually gave way to the planet's characteristic crimson. Lena awoke, feeling surprisingly refreshed, the worst of her pain dulled to manageable aches. Thrix sat cross-legged at the shelter's entrance, his posture reminiscent of meditation, bioluminescent patterns, flowing in slow, regular rhythms. "Your wounds are healing well," he said, without turning, evidently sensing her consciousness returning. "The cellular regeneration rate of humans continues to impress me." Lena sat up, running a diagnostic hand over her body. "How long was I asleep?" "Nearly 10 hours. Your need was great." She frowned. "Why didn't you wake me? We should have started moving already." Thrix turned, then fixing her with his opalescent gaze. "Because dead heroes reach no destinations, Dr. Morales. We will move when both of us can do so effectively." The rebuke, gentle as it was, silenced her. She busied herself with breaking down the shelter, while Thrix gathered the glowing plants into a fiber pouch he'd fashioned from materials in their emergency kit. "They purify water," he explained when she questioned him, "and their bioluminescence can be intensified to signal across distances if needed." As the crimson sun climbed higher, they began their journey in earnest, following the canyon for as long as it aligned with their route. Thrix moved with the fluid grace characteristic of his species, despite his injuries. Lena found herself admiring the economy of his motion. No wasted energy, each step precisely placed. "You mentioned your people have a ritual-based approach to nature," she said, as they walked partly from genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from the growing heat. "What does that entail?" Thrix was silent for several moments, seemingly gathering his thoughts. "Corrales believed that to understand a thing one must enter into relationship with it," he finally said. "Before we study a flower, we ask its permission. Before we examine soil, we offer gratitude to the elements that compose it." "That sounds inefficient," Lena observed, then winced at how dismissive her words sounded. "I mean from a research perspective." "Perhaps," Thrix conceded without offense. "But efficiency is not always synonymous with depth of understanding. Your human methods are quick, but often miss the subtle energies that connect all living things." "You mean your telepathic abilities?" "Partly. Though all Corrales possess this sense, it is merely a tool that helps us perceive connections already present in the universe." His markings shifted to a pattern she hadn't seen before, something like contemplation, mixed with reverence. "Our scientists spend years learning to open themselves to the consciousness of other species. It is how we discovered that many plants possess a form of communal awareness, or that certain mineral formations carry impressions of events that occurred around them." Lena's scientific skepticism warred with her curiosity. "That sounds more like mysticism than science." "The division between those concepts is a human construct," Thrix replied simply. "As is your distinction between observer and observed. Corrales recognized that to study a thing is to change it, and to be changed by it in turn." Their philosophical discussion was interrupted as they reached the end of the canyon. Before them stretched an expanse of open desert, the sand a pale gold that reflected the crimson sky in shimmering waves of heat. "We should rest here until the worst heat passes," Lena suggested, checking the scanner. 3 hours to peak temperature." They found shelter in the shadow of a massive rock formation. While Lena set up a minimal shade structure, Thrix disappeared briefly, returning with several bulbous plants. "Water source," he explained, slicing one open to reveal a gel-like interior. "Filtered through the plant's tissues, safer than standing water on this world." Using the water purifier as an additional precaution, they refilled their containers with the plant's moisture. The liquid had a slightly sweet mineral taste that Lena found surprisingly pleasant. "How did you know these were safe?" she asked. Thrix touched his temple, where bioluminescent patterns formed intricate whorls. "I can sense the plant's chemical composition. No toxins, harmful to either of our biologies." As they rested in the shade, Lena found herself studying her alien companion with renewed interest. The Corrales were among the first extraterrestrial species humans had encountered nearly 30 years earlier, but diplomatic relations had progressed slowly. Cultural exchange was limited, and joint missions like theirs were still rare. "What made you volunteer for this mission?" she asked impulsively. Thrix's markings pulsed, in a pattern she now recognized as thoughtfulness. "My clan has served as scouts and pathfinders for generations. It is our way of honoring the greater community." He paused, markings shifting subtly. "And I must admit to curiosity about humans. Your species is unpredictable." "Is that a compliment or criticism?" "Neither. An observation." His head tilted in that characteristic Corellis gesture. "Your kind can be brutally pragmatic one moment and irrationally altruistic the next. You build walls between yourselves, then risk everything to save strangers. You are fascinating." Lena found herself unexpectedly touched by his candor. "And what about you personally? Not your clan, but you?" For a moment she thought he might not answer. Corellis were notoriously private about individual motivations. "I am alone among my kind," he finally said, his voice dropping to that lower resonance that vibrated in her chest. "My telepathic abilities are unusually strong. It creates distance between myself and others, even other Corellis. In the vastness of space among strangers, that difference feels less significant." Lena nodded, understanding all too well the paradoxical solace of being alone among strangers, rather than alone among one's own kind. After Kaito's death and the subsequent inquiry, her colleague's sympathy had been harder to bear than outright blame would have been. "I get that," she said simply. Thrix studied her, his opalescent eyes reflecting the crimson light. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I believe you do." When the worst heat of day had passed, they continued their journey across the open desert. The landscape shifted from rocky outcroppings to vast dunes that made walking laborious. Their progress slowed significantly as they struggled through shifting sand that sometimes swallowed them ankle-deep with each step. By late afternoon, Lena's water supply was running dangerously low, despite careful rationing. The relentless heat and exertion had depleted her body's reserves faster than anticipated. Thrix, adapted to arid conditions on his homeworld, fared better, but showed signs of fatigue in the dimming of his bioluminescent patterns. When they crested a particularly steep dune, Lena paused to catch her breath, scanning the horizon with mounting concern. The vastness of the desert seemed to stretch endlessly before them, with no sign of the rocky terrain that the scanner indicated should lie ahead. "Something's wrong," she said, consulting the device. "According to this, we should be approaching the northern ridge by now, but I don't see anything but more dunes." Thrix moved to her side, studying the scanner. "The electromagnetic storm may have affected its calibration." Lena's stomach tightened with dread. Without accurate navigation, their chances of reaching the outpost dropped dramatically. She fought back a wave of panic, forcing herself to think logically. "We need higher ground for a better vantage point," she decided, looking around. "Those rock spires to the east might give us a clearer view." The detour cost them precious time and energy, but from atop the tallest spire, they finally spotted the ridgeline much further west than the scanner had indicated. The electromagnetic storm had indeed scrambled their navigation systems more severely than Lena had realized. "We'll never reach it before nightfall," she said, calculating distances with growing anxiety. "And we don't have enough water for another full day crossing the open desert." Thrix was silent, his gaze distant. Then, without warning, he closed his eyes, his bioluminescent patterns intensifying to a brilliant blue that illuminated the darkening landscape around them. For several minutes, he remained perfectly still, only the rise and fall of his chest indicating he was alive. When his eyes finally opened, he pointed southwest. "There is water in that direction, a series of pools in a depression between dune systems." Lena frowned skeptically. "How could you possibly know that?" "The plants here are connected through underground mycelial networks," he explained. "They share information about resources. I simply asked them." Despite her scientific reservations, Lena had limited options. They adjusted their course, heading southwest as the twin suns began their descent toward the horizon. To her amazement and relief, after an hour of difficult travel, they found exactly what Thrix had described, a small oasis of sorts where underground water had seeped to the surface, creating several small pools surrounded by phosphorescent vegetation. As Lena knelt to collect and purify water, She glanced up at Thrix with newfound respect. I may need to reconsider my position on Corrales' scientific methods. His markings pulsed, with what she now recognized as his version of a smile. We may yet make a believer of you, Dr. Morales. They made camp beside the pool, setting up the shelter between two large rock formations that would help regulate temperature through the cold desert night. After a sparse meal of emergency rations, Lena plotted a new course to the outpost, accounting for the scanner's drift. If we maintain a steady pace, we should reach the ridge by midday tomorrow, she calculated. From there, it's another day's journey to the outpost. Then we should continue through the night, Thrix suggested. The temperature is manageable now, and we would make better time than in tomorrow's heat. Lena shook her head firmly. Too dangerous. The scanner's readings are already compromised. We could easily get lost in the dark. I can navigate by the stars, Thrix countered, and my night vision is superior to yours. It's not just navigation, Lena insisted. We're both exhausted, and the cold will drain our energy faster than you realize. We need to rest. Thrix's markings pulsed with a pattern she hadn't seen before, sharp, rapid flashes that suggested frustration or urgency. Every hour we delay reduces our rescue window. The Aurora's light will not wait indefinitely. And they won't find us at all if we collapse from exhaustion in the middle of nowhere. Lena snapped, her own frustration mounting. We rest now, move at first light. For a tense moment, they stared at each other across the small space of the shelter. Then abruptly, Thrix's markings shifted to a calmer pattern. As you say, he conceded with surprising grace. Your experience with human limitations is greater than mine. I will trust your judgment in this matter. The simple acknowledgement caught Lena off guard. In her experience, few colleagues, human or otherwise, admitted when they were wrong with such straightforwardness. Thank you, she said somewhat awkwardly. For what it's worth, your concerns are valid. I just think the risk calculation favors caution right now. Thrix nodded, settling himself into a cross-legged position. Among Corrales, such debates are considered healthy. It is through the intersection of differing perspectives that the clearest path emerges. As night descended fully, the temperature dropped rapidly. Lena huddled deeper into the thermal blanket, watching as strange constellations emerged in the alien sky. The phosphorescent plants around the pools grew brighter in darkness, casting the oasis in an ethereal blue-green glow. It's beautiful, she murmured almost to herself. Yes. Thrix agreed, his voice that deep resonance that seemed to vibrate in her chest. Corrales have a saying, beauty is the universe's way of making hardship bearable. Something in his tone made Lena turn to study him. His bioluminescent patterns had dimmed to their nighttime configuration, subtle pulses that reminded her of a sleeping heartbeat. You have a lot of sayings, she observed with a small smile. We are an old species, he replied simply. We have had time to accumulate wisdom and to recognize how little we truly understand. A comfortable silence fell between them. Lena found herself oddly at peace despite their precarious situation. There was something about Thrix's presence that calmed her usual nervous energy, a steadiness that anchored her racing thoughts. You should sleep, he said after a time. I require less rest than humans. I will maintain watch. Lena wanted to argue but found her eyelids growing heavy. Wake me in 4 hours, she instructed. You need rest too. Of course, he agreed, though something in his tone suggested he had no intention of doing so. As she drifted toward sleep, Lena felt again that cooling mental touch, Thrix's telepathic ability, somehow soothing the anxiety that normally kept her tossing through the night. This time, she welcomed it without resistance, letting herself slip into the deepest sleep she'd experienced in years. She was awakened not by Thrix's gentle prompting as expected, but by a sharp, urgent telepathic alarm that jolted her into instant wakefulness. The shelter was bathed in the pale light of early dawn, but something was wrong. Thrix's bioluminescent patterns were pulsing in rapid, erratic sequences she'd never seen before. Don't move, he whispered, the telepathic undercurrent of his voice carrying waves of alert caution. We are surrounded. Lena froze her hand instinctively, reaching for the scanner. Thrix's four-fingered hand gently restrained her. "No technology," he murmured. "They are drawn to electrical signatures." She mouthed silently. In answer, Thrix carefully shifted his position, allowing her to see through the shelter's transparent section. What she saw made her blood run cold. Circling their camp were 6 creatures, unlike anything she'd ever encountered. Roughly the size of large dogs, they moved on multiple jointed legs that reminded her of spiders, but their bodies were covered in scale-like plates that shifted color to match the surrounding sand. Most disconcerting were their feeding appendages, transparent proboscises that extended and retracted rhythmically, dripping with what appeared to be digestive enzymes. Sand lurkers. Thrix breathed into her mind more than her ears. They hunt by sensing electrical impulses from nervous systems. Any sudden movement or activation of technology will trigger an attack response. "How do we get out of this?" Lena asked, barely moving her lips. "When I give the signal, run for the rock spire behind the shelter. Climb as high as you can. They cannot scale vertical surfaces easily." His markings pulsed in what she now recognized as preparation. "I will create a diversion." Before she could protest, Thrix's bioluminescent patterns flared to blinding intensity. The sand lurkers immediately recoiled, their feeding appendages withdrawing defensively. In that moment of confusion, Thrix gave her a telepathic push. "Now!" And Lena bolted from the shelter toward the rock formation. Behind her, she heard chittering sounds as the creatures recovered from their surprise. She didn't dare look back, focusing entirely on reaching the rocks. Her hands found purchase on the rough stone, and she pulled herself upward with desperate strength, ignoring the pain as sharp edges cut into her palms. Only when she'd reached a ledge about 3 meters up did she turn to look for Thrix. What she saw made her heart seize. The alien was surrounded using a branch of phosphorescent vegetation as a makeshift staff to keep the sand lurkers at bay. His bioluminescent patterns strobed in disorienting sequences, but 2 of the creatures had flanked him, cutting off his path to the rocks. Without conscious thought, Lena pulled the emergency flare from her belt, triggered it, and hurled it as far from the rocks as she could. The device erupted in brilliant crimson light, instantly capturing the attention of the sand lurkers. Their primitive brains, drawn to the intense electrical discharge of the flare, compelled them to abandon Thrix and scuttle rapidly toward the new stimulus. Thrix didn't waste the opportunity. He sprinted to the rock formation and climbed with astonishing agility, reaching Lena's position in seconds. Together, they scrambled higher, not stopping until they reached a wide ledge, nearly 10 meters above the desert floor. Below, the sand lurkers circled the now sputtering flare, their feeding appendages probing it curiously. When it finally died, they began a systematic sweep of the area, but showed no inclination to attempt the vertical climb. That was quick thinking. Thrix said, his breathing rapid but controlled. "Though we have now lost both shelter and supplies." Lena realized with dismay that he was right. In their haste to escape, they'd left everything except what was attached to their bodies. The shelter water purifier and most of their rations remained below, where the sand lurkers were now investigating the abandoned camp. "We couldn't exactly pack before running for our lives," she said, trying to mask her rising panic with humor. "How long will they stay?" "Until their hunting period ends at full daylight," Thrix replied. "We have perhaps an hour before it's safe to descend." Lena took stock of their situation. She still had the scanner, a small medical kit attached to her belt, and half a container of water. Thrix had retained his pouch of phosphorescent plants and a utility tool similar to a multifunction knife. Everything else was effectively lost to them. "This complicates things," she said, the understatement, almost making her laugh despite their dire circumstances. "Indeed." Thrix's markings had returned to their normal rhythm, but she noticed they were dimmer than usual, a sign of energy depletion, she guessed. "But we are alive, which means possibility remains." As they waited for the sand lurkers to disperse, the twin suns began their ascent bathing the desert in that characteristic crimson glow. Below, the creatures became increasingly agitated as daylight strengthened, eventually abandoning their investigation of the camp and disappearing into the sand itself, burying themselves with surprising speed until no trace remained. They shelter underground during daylight, Thrix explained. The heat would dehydrate their exoskeletons otherwise. When they finally deemed it safe to descend, they found the camp in ruins. The shelter had been shredded, its components scattered. The water purifier was damaged beyond repair. Most of their rations had been consumed or contaminated by the creature's digestive enzymes. "We need to move quickly," Lena said, salvaging what little they could. "The ridge is our best hope for finding more water, and we need to reach it before peak heat." Thrix nodded in agreement, his expression unreadable to human eyes, but his concern evident in the pattern of his markings. With one last look at the oasis that had nearly become their grave, they set out across the remaining expanse of desert. The journey that day pushed both of them to their limits. Without adequate water or shelter from the intensifying heat, they were forced to maintain a grueling pace while rationing their remaining supplies with brutal efficiency. Lena's exobiology training included extreme survival scenarios, but theory paled beside the reality of Epsilon 9's punishing environment. By midday, as predicted, they reached the ridgeline, a jagged formation of black volcanic rock that rose like a spine from the desert floor. The change in terrain brought new challenges, sharp, unstable surfaces that threatened twisted ankles, or worse with every step, and narrow passages where they were forced to proceed single file. "There should be more stable ground ahead," Lena said, consulting the scanner. Her voice was rough from thirst, her lips cracked and bleeding. "And the outpost is now less than 20 kilometers distant." Thrix, moving with the careful precision of someone conserving every ounce of energy, merely nodded. His silver-blue skin had taken on a concerning ashen quality, and his bioluminescent patterns were noticeably dimmer. "You're dehydrated," Lena observed with professional detachment that masked her growing worry. "As are you," he replied simply. "Corellus physiology is more sensitive to fluid loss than human," she countered. "Here, take the last of my water." Thrix's hand gently pushed the container away. "Your gesture is honorable but misguided. We both require hydration to continue." "Don't be stubborn. Your physical signs clearly indicate—" "Dr. Morales." He interrupted, his tone firmer than she'd ever heard from him. "Among Corellus, to accept sustenance while another suffers is considered deeply dishonorable. I will not do so." Lena wanted to argue further, but something in his posture told her it would be futile. Instead, she divided the remaining water equally between them, a symbolic gesture that provided little practical relief for either. As afternoon waned into evening, they found themselves in a labyrinth of rock formations. The scanner's guidance grew increasingly unreliable as the terrain interfered with its already compromised sensors. Fatigue and dehydration were taking their toll on Lena's decision-making abilities. Twice, she led them down passages that ended in sheer drops, forcing them to backtrack and lose precious time. "We should make camp," Thrix finally suggested, as darkness began to fall. "Continuing without clear navigation risks greater delay." Reluctantly, Lena agreed. They found a small alcove in the rock face that offered some protection from the wind that had begun to pick up as temperatures dropped. Without the shelter, they would be exposed to the full force of the desert night's cold, but they had little choice. Using the utility tool, Thrix managed to extract moisture from several succulent plants, growing in rock crevices, not enough to fully rehydrate them, but sufficient to stave off the worst effects of their thirst. Lena, meanwhile, created a small heat source by rigging the scanner's power cell to emit a controlled radiation signature. "It won't last more than a few hours," she warned, "and it'll drain the scanner completely." "A worthwhile trade," Thrix said, settling beside the makeshift heater. "Without rest, the scanner would be of little use to us tomorrow regardless." As they huddled near the heat source, the events of the day caught up with Lena in a rush of bone-deep exhaustion. Her muscles ached from the punishing trek, and her head throbbed with the beginnings of severe dehydration. "We're not going to make it, are we?" she said quietly, giving voice to the fear that had been building since the sandlurker attack. "The outpost is still too far and we're running on empty." Thrix was silent for a long moment, his opalescent eyes reflecting the soft glow of the heat source. "The Corrales do not believe in predestined outcomes," he finally said. "Only in the power of each moment to reshape possibility." "That's not an answer. It is the only honest one I can offer." His markings pulsed in a gentle rhythm that somehow conveyed compassion. "I cannot see the future, Lena. I can only choose how to meet each challenge as it arises." It was the first time he had used her given name without prompting, and the simple intimacy of it caught her off guard. Somehow, in the midst of their desperate situation, they had crossed an invisible boundary from colleagues to something more, companions, perhaps, or friends. "I keep thinking about Kaido," she admitted, the cold and exhaustion breaking down her usual reticence. "My research partner on Europa. When our ice crawler crashed, I couldn't get him out in time. I watched him die because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't strong enough." "And you fear the same will happen here?" Thrix said, not a question, but a gentle acknowledgement. "I can't lose another partner," Lena whispered. "I can't fail again." Thrix shifted closer, his tall frame curving protectively around her smaller one. The proximity should have felt alien, uncomfortable, but, instead, brought a surprising sense of solace. "Among Corrales, we believe that to share a hardship is to transform it," he said, his voice, that deep resonance that vibrated in her chest. "When two beings face death together, they create a bond that transcends physical existence." "Is that supposed to be comforting?" Lena asked, but without heat. His markings pulsed in what she now recognized as his version of a smile. "Perhaps not by human standards. But consider whatever comes tomorrow, you will not face it alone. Nor will I. There is power in that, Lena Morales." The simple truth of his words penetrated deeper than any conventional reassurance could have. They were indeed together in this, two beings from vastly different worlds, yet united by the most fundamental struggle of all, survival. As the makeshift heater gradually dimmed, the desert cold closed around them. Without conscious decision, they drew closer to each other, sharing body heat as a matter of practicality. Thrix's telepathic presence brushed against her mind, not invasive, but supportive, a mental equivalent of his physical proximity. "May I?" He asked, the question as much telepathic as verbal. Understanding what he offered, Lena nodded. "Yes." The cooling mental touch she had experienced before expanded, becoming a gentle wave that eased her physical discomfort and calmed her racing thoughts. It wasn't sleep exactly, but a state of meditative rest that allowed her body to recover despite the harsh conditions. In that strange, shared consciousness, Lena caught glimpses of Thrix's own thoughts, his concern for her, his determination to fulfill his duty to his clan, his curiosity about her species that had evolved into respect and something more complex. She wondered what he perceived of her mind in return, but was too exhausted to feel self-conscious about it. They passed the night in this unusual communion, neither fully awake nor truly asleep, their minds and bodies finding what rest they could in circumstances that should have allowed none. Dawn broke across the ridge in shards of amber light that gradually transformed to the familiar crimson. Lena awoke, feeling surprisingly refreshed, despite their exposed position and limited rest. Thrix was already alert, his bioluminescent patterns cycling through what she had come to recognize as his equivalent of a morning routine, systematic activation of various bodily systems. "The scanner?" she asked, noticing the device was dark. "Depleted as you predicted," Thrix confirmed. "But I believe I can navigate us using stellar positioning. The outpost should lie beyond the western edge of this ridge system." Without the scanner's guidance, they were forced to rely on more primitive methods of navigation, the position of the twin suns, the flow of the terrain, and Thrix's remarkable ability to sense water sources through local plant networks. Progress was slower, but steadier than the previous day, their pace determined by careful conservation of energy, rather than desperate haste. As they traversed the ridge, Thrix began to share stories of Corellis culture, perhaps to distract them both from their physical discomfort, or perhaps because the shared mental connection of the previous night had dissolved some barrier between them. "My clan specializes in what you might call life bonds," he explained as they picked their way across a particularly treacherous section of loose rock. "We are caretakers of the ancient rituals that connect beings across biological boundaries." "Like your ability to communicate with plants?" Lena asked, genuinely curious. "That is a rudimentary application, yes. But the deepest life bonds transcend mere communication." His markings shifted to patterns she hadn't seen before, complex, overlapping sequences that seemed to convey reverence and wonder simultaneously. When fully realized, such bonds allow energy transfer between species, healing even the creation of new life forms. "That sounds like genetic engineering." Lena observed her scientific mind, trying to categorize the concept within familiar frameworks. Thrix's markings pulsed in what she now recognized as amusement. "In a sense, though, driven by consciousness rather than technology. The Corellis believe that all life energy is fundamentally compatible, merely expressed through different physical forms. And these ceremonies, their cultural practices or biological processes." "We make no such distinction," he replied. "The ritual shapes the biology, and the biology enables the ritual. They are inseparable." The conversation carried them through the most difficult part of their journey. By midday, they had traversed the worst of the ridge and found themselves on a gradually descending slope that led to another desert basin, smaller than the one they had crossed, but no less formidable. And there, shimmering in the heat distortion on the horizon, they saw it, the abandoned outpost. Its control tower rose like a sentinel above the desert floor, half buried in sand, but unmistakable against the crimson sky. "We're going to make it," Lena breathed relief, making her lightheaded. Or perhaps that was just dehydration. "So it seems," Thrix agreed, his markings pulsing with renewed energy. "Though several hours' journey still remains." The sight of their destination gave them both a second wind. They maintained a steady pace across the basin, rationing their remaining water with ruthless efficiency. As they drew closer, details of the outpost became clearer: a main control building, several smaller structures now half collapsed, and most importantly, the beacon array atop the central tower. "Do you think it still works?" Lena asked, unable to keep the desperate hope from her voice. "The design appears to be hardened against environmental deterioration," Thrix observed. "And such installations typically include autonomous power systems. There is reason for optimism." 3 hours later, as the twin suns began their descent toward the horizon, they stood before the outpost's main entrance, a heavy pressure door, half submerged in sand. Years of exposure to Epsilon 9's harsh environment had taken their toll, but the fundamental structure remained intact. Using Thrix's utility tool and her own desperate strength, Lena managed to force the door open enough for them to squeeze through. The interior was dark air, stale but breathable, thanks to the facility's passive filtration systems. The control room would logically be at the top of the tower, Thrix said, activating his bioluminescent patterns to their brightest setting to illuminate their way. They navigated through abandoned corridors, past empty research stations and dormitories, left exactly as they had been when the facility was evacuated years earlier. Emergency systems had preserved most of the structure from decay, but fine sand had infiltrated everywhere, coating surfaces in a thin layer of pale gold dust. The control room, when they finally reached it, was a semicircular space, dominated by viewports that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding desert. Instrument panels lined the walls, their displays dark but intact. Lena moved immediately to the central console, her hands hovering over the controls. "The main systems are in standby mode," she observed, professional focus overriding her exhaustion. "If I can redirect power from the auxiliary generators, we might be able to activate the emergency beacon." While she worked on the power systems, Thrix examined the beacon array controls. The transmission array appears intact, but the focusing dishes are misaligned, likely from years of exposure to wind and temperature fluctuations. Can we fix them? With proper tools, yes, but it will require external access. For the next several hours, they worked with single-minded determination. Lena managed to reroute power from the facility's geothermal backup systems to the primary grid, bringing basic functions online. Thrix, meanwhile, located maintenance equipment that would allow them to access and repair the external array. As they prepared to venture outside, a new threat emerged. The facility's environmental sensors, now partially functional, detected an approaching storm system, not merely wind and sand, but another electromagnetic anomaly, similar to the one that had downed their shuttle. We have perhaps 2 hours before it reaches us. Thrix calculated, studying the sensor readings. Time enough to adjust the array, but with little margin for error. They climbed to the exterior maintenance platform, via an access ladder, emerging onto a narrow walkway that circled the tower. The wind had already begun to intensify, carrying stinging particles of sand that forced them to shield their eyes. Above them, the beacon array, a complex arrangement of dishes and antennae, stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. I'll need to manually realign the primary dish. Thrix said, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. Can you recalibrate the signal amplifiers from the auxiliary control panel? Lena nodded, making her way to a small console mounted on the platform wall. The controls were standard emergency beacon protocol, familiar from her survival training. With practiced efficiency, she began the calibration sequence, adjusting for Epsilon 9's unique atmospheric conditions. Above her, Thrix worked with methodical precision to reposition the massive dish. His height and strength were advantages, but the increasingly violent wind made every movement treacherous. Twice, he nearly lost his balance as particularly strong gusts buffeted the platform. The storm approached with frightening speed, visible now as a towering wall of swirling sand and energy discharges that lit the horizon with flashes of blue-white light. Time was running out. "Amplifiers calibrated," Lena shouted over the howling wind. "Ready for signal transmission." One final adjustment. Thrix called back, straining to rotate the dish's focusing element into precise alignment. With a grinding sound of long dormant mechanics, the dish locked into position. In that same moment, a powerful gust of wind tore across the platform, shattering a section of the safety railing. Lena lost her footing, sliding toward the newly formed gap and the dizzying drop beyond. Thrix moved with impossible speed, abandoning his position at the dish to lunge for her. His four-fingered hand closed around her wrist, just as she slid over the edge, arresting her fall with a jolt that sent pain shooting through her shoulder. For one terrible moment they hung suspended, Lena dangling over the abyss Thrix anchored, only by his grip on a structural support. Then, with a surge of strength, he pulled her back onto the platform and into the relative safety of the access hatch. "The dish," Lena gasped once they were inside. "Is aligned," Thrix assured her. "We must activate the beacon immediately. The storm will be upon us in minutes." They raced back to the control room, where Lena immediately began the transmission sequence. Power levels fluctuated as the storm's electromagnetic interference grew stronger, but the backup systems held. Signal initialized, she reported, fingers flying across the controls. Transmission power at 60% and holding. Thrix monitored the external sensors. The storm has accelerated. Impact in less than 5 minutes. Outside the viewports, the world had transformed into a maelstrom of howling sand and crackling energy. The entire structure groaned under the assault, vibrating with each new gust. "We need more power to punch through that interference," Lena said, studying the readouts with growing alarm. "The signal's degrading too quickly." Thrix was silent for a moment, his markings pulsing in rapid, complex patterns she couldn't interpret. Then, with sudden decision, he placed his hands on the transmission module. "My people's gift is energy transference," he said, his voice dropping to that deeper resonance that vibrated in her chest. I can amplify the signal, but the process is not without risk. Before Lena could protest, Thrix's bioluminescent patterns flared to blinding intensity. Energy visibly flowed from his body into the transmission system threads of brilliant blue light that snaked along the controls and up through the ceiling toward the beacon array. The effect was immediate. Power levels surged, the transmission strength doubling, then tripling. On the monitor, the signal penetrated the storm interference, broadcasting clearly into space. But the cost was evident. Thrix's silver-blue skin paled to ashen gray, his markings flickering erratically. When he finally released his connection to the system, he staggered backward, collapsing into Lena's arms. "What have you done?" she demanded, easing him to the floor, her medical training already assessing his condition. His pulse was rapid and irregular, his breathing shallow. "Ensured our message reaches those who can help," he replied, his voice barely audible. "The signal will continue, long enough." The storm struck with full force. Lights flickered throughout the facility as power systems struggled against the electromagnetic assault. The viewports darkened as sand and debris pelted the exterior, reducing visibility to near zero. For Lena, however, the storm outside paled in comparison to her concern for Thrix. His condition deteriorated rapidly, his bioluminescent patterns growing dimmer with each passing minute. "Stay with me," she urged, administering what little medical treatment she could with their limited supplies. "The beacon is working. Help will come." "I am not dying," Thrix assured her, though his weakened state suggested otherwise. "Merely depleted." The energy transfer was more demanding than anticipated. As if in response to his words, a strange phenomenon began his markings, though dim, started pulsing in distinct rhythms that seemed to resonate with something inside Lena herself. She felt an unusual warmth spreading through her palms, where they touched his skin, a tingling sensation that traveled up her arms and into her chest. "What's happening?" she asked, both scientific curiosity and alarm evident in her voice. Thrix's opalescent eyes widened with surprise, then understanding, then what appeared to be awe. "The life bond," he whispered. "It forms without intent, when conditions are precisely aligned." The sensation intensified, becoming a tangible connection between them, energy flowing not just from him to the beacon, but between their bodies in a circuit of warmth and light. Lena's scientific mind raced to categorize the experience, but found no framework that could contain it. "I don't understand," she said, though some deeper part of her did recognize the profound intimacy of what was occurring between them. "Among my people," Thrix explained, his voice stronger now, as energy flowed back into him through their connection. "Such bonds are sacred, usually formed with intention and ceremony. But sometimes, in moments of great need or significance, they manifest spontaneously." Before Lena could respond, a surge of dizziness overcame her. She swayed, suddenly lightheaded, and might have fallen if not for Thrix's steadying hands. "Lena." His voice held concern, but also dawning comprehension. "The transfer, it has affected you differently than expected." The room seemed to spin around her. Nausea rose in waves, accompanied by a strange luminescence that appeared to emanate from her own skin, a subtle glow, visible especially around her palms, reminiscent of Thrix's bioluminescent patterns. "I think I'm going to be sick," she managed before darkness crept in from the edges of her vision and consciousness slipped away. She awoke to relative quiet. The storm had passed, leaving only the soft whisper of settling sand against the facility's exterior. Thrix knelt beside her, his expression unreadable to human eyes, but his concern evident in the attentive tilt of his head. "How long was I unconscious?" she asked, struggling to sit up. "Several hours," he replied, helping her to a more comfortable position. "The storm has passed. Our beacon continues to transmit." Memory returned in a rush. The energy transfer, the strange connection between them, the glow that had emanated from her own skin. Looking down at her hands now, She saw no visible change, yet something felt fundamentally different within her body. "What happened to me?" she asked, scientific curiosity momentarily overriding personal concern. Thrix's markings cycled through several complex patterns before settling into what she interpreted as somber acknowledgement. "The life bond activated fully between us," he said carefully. "Among Corellis, such bonds serve many purposes: healing knowledge, transfer spiritual communion, and reproduction." Lena added the implication, suddenly starkly clear. He inclined his head, neither confirming nor denying. "Between Corellis, yes. Between our species. Such a thing was thought impossible." 1,000 questions clamored in Lena's mind, but before she could voice any of them, the facility's communication system crackled to life. Through a haze of static came a voice, human, professional, wonderfully real. "Unidentified beacon, this is Rescue Vessel Horizon responding to emergency signal. Please confirm status and personnel." Thrix helped Lena to the command console, where she activated the response channel with shaking hands. "Horizon. This is Dr. Lena Morales of Survey Vessel Aurora's Light. With me is Thrix of Corellis. We are survivors of a shuttle crash 5 days ago. Request immediate evacuation." "Confirmed, Dr. Morales. We have your location. Stand by for atmospheric approach. ETA 30 minutes. Relief washed over Lena in a dizzying wave. "They found us," she whispered. "We're going to make it." Thrix's markings pulsed in what she now recognized as his version of a smile, though tempered with something more complex. "Yes, though our journey may be just beginning in other ways." As they waited for rescue, they spoke little, both processing the implications of what had occurred between them. Lena conducted a basic medical self-assessment, noting several physiological changes: elevated body temperature, unusual sensitivity to light, and most concerning cellular activity in her reproductive system that correlated with early pregnancy. Yet fear was only one component of her emotional response. There was also wonder, curiosity, and something deeper, a sense of connection to Thrix that transcended their differences and the brevity of their acquaintance. "What happens now?" she finally asked, as the distant sound of approaching engines reached them. Thrix's markings cycled through patterns she couldn't interpret before settling into a configuration she'd come to associate with thoughtful consideration. "Among my people, life bonds are celebrated as the universe's highest blessing," he said carefully. "But I understand that for humans, especially in these circumstances, the situation may appear more complicated." "That's putting it mildly," Lena said with a weak laugh. "An interspecies pregnancy is unprecedented. The medical, ethical, and political implications alone are staggering." "Yes." His opalescent eyes held hers steadily. "I will support whatever decision you make, Lena Morales. My clan's honor demands no less, but more importantly my own. Regard for you requires it." The simple sincerity of his declaration touched her deeply. Before she could respond, however, the facility trembled with the arrival of the rescue vessel, a sleek, atmospheric craft settling onto the landing pad outside. Within minutes, the rescue team had breached the facility, a mixed crew of humans and Corellis, their faces showing equal measures of relief and astonishment at finding the stranded explorers alive. The medical officer, a brisk woman with short-cropped hair, immediately began examining them both. Her scanner passed over. Lena paused, passed again. Her eyes widened. "Dr. Morales," she said carefully, "I'm detecting some unusual readings from your scan. Were you exposed to any unknown biological or radiological agents during your time here?" Lena met Thrix's gaze across the room. In that moment of silent communication, a decision was made. "Actually," Lena said, turning back to the medical officer, "there's something you should know. Something unprecedented." The journey back to the Aurora's Light passed in a blur of medical examinations, debriefings, and barely contained excitement among the scientific community aboard the vessel. News of their survival had been cause for celebration. News of Lena's condition sparked a scientific and diplomatic firestorm. In the ship's medical bay, doctors confirmed what Lena already knew. She was carrying a viable hybrid embryo, the first of its kind in recorded history. The fertilization mechanism, energy transfer, rather than conventional reproduction, defied existing scientific paradigms and opened new frontiers in xenobiology. The ship's captain, initially concerned about potential diplomatic complications, was swayed by the Corellis contingent's reaction. Far from viewing the development as problematic, they regarded the life bond between Lena and Thrix as a profound honor, a cosmic blessing that transcended ordinary relations between their species. On the final evening before they would rendezvous with the main fleet, Lena stood on the observation deck watching as Epsilon 9 receded into the distance. The harsh world that had nearly claimed their lives, yet had ultimately transformed them in ways neither could have imagined. Thrix joined her at the viewport, his presence now a familiar comfort, rather than an alien curiosity. His recovery had been remarkable, his energy fully restored, his markings once again vibrant with life. "The Corellis representatives have requested that I return with them to our homeworld," he said, after a moment of companionable silence. "They wish to record this unprecedented bond in the ancestral archives." Lena felt a pang of what disappointment. Fear of facing this strange new reality alone. "I see," she said carefully. "When do you leave?" "That depends," he replied, his markings pulsing in that pattern she now recognized as his version of a smile. "On what answer you give to my proposition." Which is, "Come with me." The simple invitation carried the weight of worlds. "Not as a specimen for study, but as my bonded partner. Learn our ways as I have learned yours. Let us discover together what this new life means for us, and perhaps for the future of both our kinds." Lena turned fully to face him, studying the alien being, who had become in the space of a few intense days, the most significant relationship of her life. "You realize this is crazy," she said, but without conviction. "We barely know each other." "By conventional measures, perhaps," Thrix acknowledged. "But we have shared survival minds and now life itself. There are married couples of 100 years who have experienced less true knowing." She couldn't argue with that logic. Their shared ordeal had compressed a lifetime of experience into days, revealing core truths about each other that might have taken years to discover under normal circumstances. "What about my work, my life here?" "The joint initiative has already proposed a special research commission to study our unique situation," Thrix reminded her. "Your expertise would be central to that work regardless of where we are based. And the Corellis have extended an unprecedented invitation for human scientists to establish a research outpost on our homeworld." It was true. In the day since their rescue, the diplomatic landscape between humans and Corellis had shifted dramatically. Their personal connection had become a symbol of new possibilities between species that had maintained cautious, limited relations for decades. Lena placed a hand unconsciously over her abdomen, where new life grew impossible. Miraculous life that defied every scientific principle she had once held immutable. "I don't know your world," she said, voicing her final reservation. "Your customs, your language. Nor did I know yours once," Thrix replied simply. "Yet here we stand." His four-fingered hand extended toward hers, palm up in invitation. "New worlds await discovery, Lena Morales. Shall we explore them together?" Looking into his opalescent eyes, Lena found her answer had formed before she'd consciously considered it. Life had always been about discovery for her, pushing boundaries, seeking knowledge. Why should that change now, simply because the frontier had become more personal? She placed her hand in his, feeling that now familiar warmth flow between them, no longer alien, but simply part of a new reality she was still learning to navigate. "Yes," she said. "Let's explore them together." From the viewport, Epsilon 9 was now just a crimson dot among countless stars, the backdrop to a beginning, rather than an ending. Before them stretched possibilities neither had imagined when their journey began, a child of two worlds, a bond that transcended species and horizons, limited only by their courage to venture into the unknown. For Lena Morales, exobiologist, and now participant in the very phenomenon she had spent her career studying, the greatest discovery had been the one she never sought. That connection could form across the vast gulfs that separated species, and that life, resilient, adaptive, miraculous life, would always find a way to bridge the distance between worlds. Beyond the viewport, the twin suns of Epsilon 9 glowed like distant embers against the void, silent witnesses to a transformation that would ripple across two civilizations, reshaping definitions of family species, and perhaps even life itself. In their crimson light, Lena and Thrix stood together, not human and alien now, but simply two beings united by an unexpected journey and the promise of all that was yet to come.